Hey guys, I'm Heidi Prieb. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if this is your first time here. This month on this channel, we're talking about heartbreak. And today in particular, we're talking about the pain of moving on from a limerent object and why it can be so hard to do that. So if you don't know what I mean when I say the term limerent object or limerence, I do have a video that I'm going to link in the description of this one that unpacks that term and helps you recognize when you might be experiencing limerence and how it shows up in your life and your relationships. But for those of you who are already familiar with the term, what I want to talk about today is why it can feel so hard to move on from a limerent relationship. In a lot of cases, it can feel much harder than moving on from relationships we had that were more grounded in authentic connection. And I think that for a lot of people who experience limerence, there can be a lot of shame that comes up when we're trying to get over a limerent object and realizing that it's just not happening, or it's not happening on the timeline that we would want it to. And I think a really big reason for this is because we aren't differentiating in our minds the difference between a limerent relationship and an authentically connected relationship. Getting over each of those things is a fundamentally different process. So if we are treating getting over limerence the way we would treat getting over the breakup of a relationship that was more grounded in presence and connection, we are going to be barking up the wrong tree and finding ourselves continuously frustrated. It's kind of like taking cold medication when what you're experiencing is an allergic reaction. If we're not properly diagnosing the problem, it's going to be really hard to treat it. So what we're going to talk about today is how limerence is fundamentally different from authentic real-time connection and how the exit routes out of limerence are going to be different, as well as how we can start spotting them so that if we find ourselves in this place where we're really stuck on this person that we may never have actually dated or had a real intimate connection with, we can make clear for ourselves what exactly it is that we're struggling to move on from and what skills we're going to have to acquire in order to do that. So we're going to go into 3 primary reasons why limerence is so hard to get over, as well as where those exit routes out of each of these problems might be. The first reason why limerence can be so hard to get over is because limerent relationships are trying to answer a fundamentally different question for us internally than non-limerent relationships are. So when we have a non-limerent relationship, so a relationship that is mostly based in reality, where we are not idealizing or projecting or putting someone on a pedestal in any significant way, the question that we are generally trying to answer through that relationship is, are we a good fit? Is this person compatible with me and my values and what I want out of life? Do we have things to offer each other that we both are going to be happy to give and receive? So in a secure relationship, on average, we walk away from an interaction feeling satisfied if it feels like we have been in honest connection with that person, and we enjoy what that honest, authentic connection feels like. In a limerent relationship, the question underlying the relationship tends to be, am I okay? So it's not about how you and the other person authentically fit together or how your values authentically align. It's a question of, do I feel good? And does my self-esteem feel bolstered through my connection with this person? So when we're limerent, we usually walk away from an interaction feeling satisfied if our self-esteem feels good after the interaction, regardless of whether or not we were actually connecting with the person. So when we look at that secure connection, is this person a good fit for me? If the answer is no, even if there's things that you really like about someone, it's going to be natural to move on so you can both find people who are better fits for you. But if the question that you're trying to answer through your relationship with someone is, am I okay as a person? And what you're predominantly looking for unconsciously out of that relationship is validation and a sense of self-esteem, you are not necessarily going to walk away from that relationship at the point where the two of you are a bad fit, because that isn't your highest priority. Your highest priority is soothing whatever unconscious pain is causing you to need to externalize your sense of self-worth. And that pain can go on for much longer than the relationship itself ends up working for in reality. So, something that would pose a big problem in a secure relationship and potentially end the relationship might not even clock as a problem if your relationship is predominantly limerence based. For example, if a secure person gets into a relationship with someone else and they start to realize this person just doesn't really get me and I don't really get them, we're not really clicking, we're not really able to go deep with each other and mirror each other in the ways that feel important for me to be mirrored by another person. That's going to be a pretty clear indication that that relationship probably just isn't the right one for you. However, in a limerent relationship, you might actually be trying to avoid getting mirrored by another person because your entire worldview might be governed by toxic shame, and you might believe that if someone were to ever really see you and mirror the deepest parts of you, they would be absolutely disgusted. So, getting into a relationship with someone who you don't actually have that much in common with, and then covering up that lack of intimacy with limerence is going to be quite adaptive. It's going to make you keep feeling like, okay, I'm good, I'm all right, I'm validated as long as this person keeps approving of me. And because I'm not actually showing them my real self, I don't feel threatened inside of this relationship. Even though this relationship is by definition not a secure one if I am not showing up to it honestly and allowing myself to be seen and to see the other person clearly. So if this is the situation that we find ourselves in, and then we get left by the other person, it might feel really confusing because to the other person, especially if they're more secure, it might be clear to them why the relationship wasn't working out. But because we unconsciously are not looking at the same criteria when it comes to staying in versus leaving the relationship, we might stay really hung up on a relationship that we actually didn't have that much intimacy inside of because it was giving us that sense of, I'm okay. Because this person is approving of me, I can feel good about myself. And when that's the question that we are unconsciously trying to answer through our relationships, we're not going to pick the most sensical relationships to be in. And it might feel really confusing when we can't seem to get over someone who we know on a cognitive level we didn't have that much in common with and weren't a great fit for. And so the kind of exit route out of this problem, we have to learn to detach the question of, am I okay, from our thoughts about our limerent object. So directly target the part of ourselves that needed that validation from that person so badly. When we are experiencing limerence, what we are doing is projecting some part of our self-relationship and our own wounded self-esteem onto another person and believing that their love can fix the ways in which we don't love ourselves. This is not an interpersonal problem, it's a self-esteem one. So it gets healed through working directly on our sense of self-esteem. And the more we do that, and the more we're able to get that sense of validation and inner okayness from other sources, the less kind of shiny and magical our limerent objects start looking. And the more they start looking like regular people, just like ourselves, who we could connect with or not connect with. But either way, the connection's going to be most satisfying when we are most in reality with each other. The next reason why we might struggle to get over limerence is because it might be the best defense that we currently have available to us against loneliness. So I find that very often the people who experience chronic limerence are people who have really deep wounds or blocks in the areas that would allow us to experience intimacy with people. And these are not blocks or wounds that anybody would choose to have. They're often a product of the way that we learn to adapt to our early environments by not allowing ourselves to be deeply seen and mirrored by other people, often because we believe that there was something wrong with us. And when that's the case, we tend to develop this idea that I can be loved and cared about by another person only when I'm acting as if I am perfect. And when we go into a relationship with that idea in our heads, what we tend to do is go in with a really strong mask on. So we show only the best parts of ourselves, and we hide at all costs anything that is not flattering. And then the second we can kind of no longer keep up the facade, we retreat from the relationship, either literally or emotionally. And when we are retreated from a relationship, what we're often experiencing is loneliness. Because whatever came up for us, whether it was anger, whether it was a sense of inadequacy, whatever it was that we felt we couldn't show to this other person, is now the pain that we are left to deal with alone. And when we are left to deal with that pain, if we do not have the internal resources to regulate ourselves around it, going to limerent fantasy can be a really nice way of mentally and emotionally escaping that pain. So you might find that you have periods of time where you are more or less limerent. And that might be because there are periods of your life where you are more or less aware of that void of intimacy that you have in your life if you don't have the skills for creating it healthily. So I think I've talked about this in a previous video, but I remember reading the book The Fantasy Bond by Robert Firestone for the first time. It's one of my all-time favorite books. And it was like this wall broke inside of my brain where I understood what secure love was for the first time. I understood that love means being present with someone not just when they are at their best, but also when they are struggling, and not feeling turned off or disgusted or turning away from a person in the moments when they are imperfect. And often, particularly those of us who grew up with more avoidant patterning, internalized from a young age by no fault of our own, and often by no fault deliberately of our caregivers, they may just have been socialized the same way, to believe that love was about encouraging the best in people and ignoring or politely turning away from people's pain and struggle and the ways in which they were not yet or not ever showing up perfectly. But if you think that love is always supposed to look and feel perfect, and that you and the other person are always supposed to be perfect in love, you are going to really struggle to create truly intimate connections. Because truly intimate connections are connections where people see all parts of each other and choose to stay on the page with each other when it gets uncomfortable and unflattering. So I do have a whole video that goes over this specifically called the Toxic Shame Limerence Cycle, and I will link it in the description of this video. But essentially what we want to get clear on here is that the exit point, if this is why you're stuck on limerence, is to learn the skills for building true intimacy. So once again, I will link some videos in the description of this one around intimacy building. But this might mean making a fundamental shift in the way that we think of romantic relationships. And if we are able to make that shift and learn the skills for building true deep intimacy, we're going to feel less of that loneliness that causes us to turn to limerence to get our intimacy needs met in fantasy because we're not getting them met in reality. And the third reason why limerence can be so hard to let go of is because limerence might be serving a very important purpose for us, which is we might be using fantasy to keep something in our conscious awareness that we are unable to tolerate the direct conscious experience of. So that sounds like psychobabble. I will make this clear. John Bowlby, who was the father of attachment theory, one of the fundamental principles that he based the theory on is this concept called defensive exclusion. So when we are young, if there is information that it would be psychologically intolerable for us to integrate into our awareness, so maybe something like my parent is not perfect, what we learn to do is systematically omit from our awareness any pieces of evidence that might point to that psychologically intolerable piece of information. The problem is that when we are adults, we are able to tolerate much more than we were when we were children because we are no longer dependent on our caregivers. So in theory, we no longer need to see them as perfect, or in the opposite case, as all bad, so that we can keep seeing ourselves as good. But these patterns of thinking have already become so entrenched in our worldview that now we have blind spots we're unaware of. Whenever we have a blind spot we're unaware of, it means some part of our mind is still taking in the information that we find too threatening to experience consciously, and so it's going to come up unconsciously. So I'll give a more clear example. Let's say from a young age, I've had a very negative self-image, so a lot of toxic shame. And that might actually have been adaptive for me in my early environment, because maybe in the environment that I grew up in, I was shamed or put down if I spoke highly of myself because it was seen as bragging. And so, in this example, if I learn to think of myself as someone who is not very worthy, it is going to stop me unconsciously from bragging about myself and getting shamed. So, it serves an adaptive purpose. But there is a part of me, no matter how deeply I try to bury it, that knows that I'm deserving of dignity and that it makes sense to feel proud of what I have done well. So now that part of me that I cannot consciously integrate because it is too threatening for me to do so is going to start coming out in something like fantasies. So maybe I meet someone and develop limerence around them, and I become obsessed with the idea that they might notice my value and my worth, and I start obsessively fantasizing about how good it would feel to receive praise from them. In reality, this is the praise that I have disconnected from my image of myself because it was once threatening for me to acknowledge and admit to myself that there were things that I was proud of. So now I'm projecting it outwards onto another person in order to keep that part of my unconscious experience active and alive and in my awareness, because it is part of my wholeness as a person to feel proud of myself. But again, I've had to consciously disconnect from that, so it's coming out in this kind of subconscious way through fantasies or whatever it is. So in this way, limerence can actually serve as a lesson. It can be pointing us towards the disowned parts of ourselves that we want to integrate. And so what we want to really think about here is what's happening in our limerent fantasies. How are our limerent objects treating us? Or what traits do they have that we are almost obsessively in admiration of? And do we possess those same traits in ourselves, or are those traits that we have learned to repress for whatever reason in ourselves? This can often point us towards areas where we need to do some integration work. And so the exit route out of limerence here is noticing what it is that we're so desperate for, that we have all of this obsession around that we're projecting onto another person, and recognizing that is how badly a part of me wants to integrate this trait. And if I can spend some time doing that and working on building up that part of myself, we're going to once again find that our limerence starts naturally dissipating, and we're starting to see other people more clearly because we're seeing ourselves as on par with them. So now it's just about going out and figuring out, who do I match well with? Who is able to mirror the parts of me that I like about myself back to me, as well as the parts of myself that I don't like as much? Who can hold both things with compassion? And who can I do the same thing for? Who can I tolerate being around not only when I'm seeing them as perfect, but also when I'm seeing them in a less flattering light? And as soon as we're looking for relationships based on that criteria, we are no longer needing to cover up all of the murky parts of being human with limerence. And that begins the process of having reality-based relationships. So for example, I once had a romantic relationship end in a way that, in reality, I knew there was no going back to. But in the coming weeks, I noticed myself continuously returning to thoughts of this person and having these thoughts like, oh, should I go back? Should I try again? Should I reach out and contact them? And at this point, I'd been mostly limerence sober for long enough in my life that that kind of raised a red flag in my brain. I went, okay, I know that by all secure principles, this person and I were not a good fit, and there is not a good reason for me to return to that relationship. So what I'm going to do is really examine the thoughts and the feelings I'm having come up around this person. And so the more I sat with my thoughts and my feelings around this person, the more I noticed that what I was most craving was the solitude and stillness that I felt inside of my relationship with this person. Because at a young age, something I had internalized was I have to be in constant motion, working my butt off in order to get anything that I want out of life. And it was psychologically threatening for me to even think about carving out intentional time and space for me to simply do nothing and be still. But this person who is no longer a part of my life was someone who was exceptionally good at prioritizing that in their own life, and who really had internalized the value of taking time for stillness and deep reflection. And because it was still psychologically threatening for me to internalize that I could hold that same value, because again, my whole worldview was oriented around good things come to those who go out and chase after them with everything they have in them, I was projecting that need for stillness onto that other person, which showed me an area that I really needed to integrate inside of myself. And so the idea here is that limerence is often pointing us towards the parts of ourselves that we have not yet integrated. And if we can be present with those parts of ourselves and start sculpting out space for them inside of our lives, we might naturally find that once again, our limerence starts to fade and we start to see other people and ourselves, as well as our compatibility with other people, much more realistically. So just to reiterate, the idea here is that if you are feeling a surplus of shame because you feel like you aren't getting over a limerent object on a regular timeline or through the usual ways that we get over breakups, it's probably because you have not yet acknowledged that the end of a limerent relationship and the end of a secure relationship are two completely different things. To get rid of limerence, we have to tackle it at the core, which is whatever wound is causing us to project a part of our wholeness onto another person. And once we're able to heal that wound, limerence naturally falls away from our worldview. We just need to make sure we're taking the right medicine for the problem that we actually have. All right, I think that's all I have to say for today on this topic. As always, let me know in the comments what you're thinking, feeling, any questions you have as you've gone through this video. As always, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you back here again really soon.